At 10, images emerge of dozens of Palestinian men being rounded up and held by Israeli forces in Gaza. Stripped to their underwear, hands tied behind their backs, Israel says suspects are being interrogated. Our international editor Jeremy Bowen assesses these new pictures. Also tonight, despite disquiet in his party, the Prime Minister defends his plans to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda, saying he will finish the job. The poet, professor and performer Benjamin Zephaniah has died just weeks after being diagnosed with a brain tumour. He was 65. And how this street in Manchester was secretly transformed into a catwalk for Chanel tonight.
On BBC London, a ULEZ camera has been blown up in south-east London. It's damaged nearby cars and properties. Police say the explosive device could have caused serious injury.
Good evening. Images have emerged today from Gaza, which appear to show dozens of Palestinian men on their knees, stripped to their underwear, being held by Israel Defense Forces. It's not clear if they have surrendered or if they have been taken by the military. Israel has not said who the men are, but it has confirmed that its forces are making arrests in Gaza. The new images come as tens of thousands of Palestinians are streaming into Rafah city near the Gaza Strip's southern border with Egypt, trying to escape intense fighting elsewhere. The head of humanitarian affairs for the United Nations says there is no longer any humanitarian operation worthy of that name in the south of Gaza. From Jerusalem, here's our international editor Jeremy Bowen, a warning you may find some of his images upsetting.
Video emerged this afternoon of Palestinian men taken for interrogation. BBC staff recognised the town of Beit Lahia in northern Gaza, and we've geolocated the video there too. Palestinian diplomats said these were savage images, evoking humanity's darkest times. The Israeli army said only that suspects were being interrogated. Posts on social media said the men had been sheltering with their families at a UN school and that others were killed during the Israeli raid. In this photo, the men have been moved to another location which we have not been able to verify. One of the captives, Dia Al-Khalout, is a journalist. He was forced to leave his disabled daughter, according to the newspaper he works for in London. Earlier, at Israel's parliament, a prominent government supporter told me that only Israeli forces can control Gaza, not the independent Palestine the Americans want.
I think that when we talk about two-state solutions, we are using three words and three lies. It's not two, it's not a state, it's definitely not a solution.
So what's the answer? An everlasting occupation?
First, occupation is not the word. One cannot occupy its own land. Israel is not an occupier in Israel because that's the land of Israel.
So what about Gaza?
Again,
that's the land of Israel?
Land of Israel, you cannot be occupying it. We're not occupying it from anyone.
In Gaza, civilians are lost in the rubble of Israeli strikes. So far, the world is not close to controlling the powerful, chaotic forces unleashed by this war. The UN Secretary-General, saying international peace and security is in jeopardy, is demanding an immediate ceasefire. A Palestinian leader told me that the US and UK must not veto the next ceasefire resolution.
The United States of America and Britain now has the key. If they oppose a resolution about immediate ceasefire, they will not be complicit only with this aggression. They will be a participant in these war crimes. They have to approve the ceasefire immediately because what is at stake is the life of 2.3 million people now. Half of them are children.
Without a political solution, this conflict will go on when, if, Israel declares victory in Gaza. The war will not have a neat ending. Two opposing forces are at work here. On the one hand, pressure for a ceasefire. On the other, the determination of the Americans and the British to give Israel the time it needs to achieve its objectives. And one Western diplomat I talked to was thinking about perhaps another month. Now, the UN Secretary General wants to hurry that process up. by putting pressure on them and also shaming them into taking action sooner. As Gaza's food queues get longer, the UN says it cannot run a dependable humanitarian operation. With hungry people jumping warehouse fences, Israel says world peace requires Gaza's liberation from Hamas, and that will take force. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Jerusalem.
The Prime Minister has urged MPs to back his Rwanda plan after growing criticism from within his own party. Rishi Sunak said his new legislation was the toughest immigration law ever, would prevent legal challenges and finally allow deportation flights carrying illegal migrants to take off for East Africa. He said the draft law addressed the concerns of the Supreme Court, which had previously judged the policy to be unlawful. Here's our political editor, Chris Mason.
Autumn of last year, Rishi Sunak becomes Prime Minister. The Rwanda plan is already 6 months old. But as the seasons turn, no migrants are sent to East Africa. Winter becomes summer and still no planes are leaving. And then the Supreme Court this autumn said it was unlawful. The slogan on the lectern is familiar, and boat crossings are down.
Good morning.
But the Prime Minister felt compelled to sell his new plan after his former immigration minister resigned, reckoning it's a dud.
We simply cannot have a situation where our ability to control our borders and stop people taking perilous journeys across the Channel is held up in endless litigation in our courts. For the people who say you should do something different, the difference between them and me is an inch. But that inch, by the way, is the difference between the Rwandans participating in this scheme and not.
Are you saying to your MPs bluntly on all of this, back me or sack me?
What I'm saying, not just to my MPs, but the entire country, is that I share their frustration. Right? My patience with this has worn thin. It's patently unfair what is happening at the moment, which is why it requires action like this that is novel, that is contentious, but that's what we're about. We're about getting stuff done on the things that matter. This matters, and we're going to make sure that we deliver.
So what exactly is this new plan? The Safety of Rwanda bill, where I was the other day when the Home Secretary visited Kigali to sign a treaty with the country, will say Rwanda is safe and give ministers the power to disregard parts of the Human Rights Act. But critics reckon it doesn't go far enough and it'll still get gummed up in the courts.
Ultimately, this bill will fail. That's what I'm just being honest about where we are. We've put 2 acts of parliament through already. We've done huge amounts of work to stop this problem. We have not succeeded in stopping the boats. Time is running out. We cannot afford to put forward yet another bill that is destined to fail.
Will he lead the Conservatives into the next general election?
Listen, I hope he does.
I hope he does is about as tepid an endorsement of a Prime Minister as you're likely to hear. And here's another tricky thing for Rishi Sunak. Others in the Conservative Party, including the 100-plus MPs and peers too in what's called the One Nation caucus, have a different instinct.
It's rather like a bill which says that Parliament has decided that all dogs are cats. But we know that all dogs are not cats. But we're being told that apparently Parliament has reached a conclusion that Rwanda is safe, when the evidence before the Supreme Court and the courts below it was that it wasn't.
And all this after Robert Jenrick packed it in as Immigration Minister, suggesting the Prime Minister needed to be more brave and more willing to contest international law. Replacing Mr Jenrick at the Home Office, 2 men. Michael Tomlinson is the Minister for Illegal Migration and Tom Pursglove is Minister for Legal Migration.
Emergency legislation, and now emergency reshuffle, and as we speak, an emergency press conference. It's total chaos. They are now in freefall, unable to govern. All the while, families worried about paying their bills and affording Christmas.
MPs will debate the latest Rwanda plan on Tuesday, its future and the Prime Minister's authority up in lights.
Well, Chris is with me now. So this all does come to a head next week with a vote in Parliament.
Yeah, it does. And between now and then, the various tribes within the Conservative Party, a few of which you had a flavour of there, have gone away to scrutinise it, often with their own legal experts poring over line by line of this bill. all of which presents me with a flashback to the Brexit years when there were very similar arguments that went on in different corners of the Conservative Party scrutinising legislation then. Now, the twist is that these groups are not homogenous. So when you hear from one of them, they're not necessarily representing the view of what can be hundreds of their colleagues. But they're looking at it this weekend. They're going to decide on that basis how or whether they will vote come Tuesday. Prime Minister, you know, today talked about the importance of parliamentary sovereignty in this new act, as he hopes it will become. He's feeling that parliamentary sovereignty now because of what his MPs are saying. He did say today, after repeated questioning, he doesn't regard next week as a confidence vote, i.e. one that would bring about an election if he lost. There is no doubt, though, it tests his authority.
Absolutely. I mean, he is under intense pressure. He is staking an awful lot on this. Where does it leave him?
You got a sense of the pressure today in that he hosted that news conference. He's not a naturally performative Prime Minister. He doesn't race towards the cameras for their own sake. He did it because he'd run out of better ideas. He'd had his former Home Secretary and his former Immigration Minister trashing his policy and had to come out and make the case for it. Now, when I speak to Conservatives across the party, in government and out, there is a fear, whether they support Rishi Sunak or not, that by accident the party could walk towards a situation where enough MPs demand a vote of confidence that it ends up happening. Now, most think that Rishi Sunak, if that were to happen, and it may not, would win it. But if it happened, it would be hugely, hugely damaging. The party chairman, Richard Holden, said today about the idea of a leadership race, which is lots of hoops down the track, that would be insanity. The thing is, the last couple of years, if you discounted the ludicrous, the implausible, the highly unlikely, well, things would have been turned out rather different. So you can't discount those. Who knows? It's a big moment next week for the Prime Minister.
Chris Mason, thank you. Boris Johnson has told the Covid inquiry that claims he didn't care about the suffering being inflicted on the country and wanted to let Covid rip were simply not right. Appearing for a second day, the former Prime Minister said he had experienced at first hand during his time in intensive care how appalling Covid could be. Our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, reports.
Summer 2020, the end of the first lockdown. The government was keen to boost the economy, get people spending again. As Chancellor, Rishi Sunak did his bit, despite some warnings that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme could spread the virus. Boris Johnson has previously insisted that medical experts like Sir Patrick Vallance and Sir Chris Whitty were consulted about the idea, something they've denied.
But now today, you're saying you're not sure whether it was discussed with them, and you're surprised that it wasn't. Is that the position?
The reason I said that in my statement is because I frankly assumed that it must have been discussed with them, and I'm perplexed.
In light of your views secretly held about people dying having reached their time anyway.
Mr Johnson looked irritated when he was read extracts from Sir Patrick Vallance's diary, suggesting he advocated letting the virus rip.
Frankly, it does not do justice to what we did, our thoughts, our feelings, my thoughts, my feelings, to say that we were remotely reconciled to fatalities across the country.
Questioning then turned to rule breaking. First, his chief advisor Dominic Cummings' visit to Barnard Castle.
It was a bad moment, and I won't pretend otherwise.
And what about the parties in Downing Street, which led to more than 100 fines, including ones for the former and current Prime Ministers? He apologised again, but said he and staff thought they were within the rules.
The version of events that has entered the popular consciousness about what is supposed to have happened in Downing Street is a million miles from the reality of what actually happened in Number 10.
Bereaved families said today that Mr Johnson was unfit for power and had failed to act quickly enough to protect lives. He, though, told the inquiry what he'd felt after being in hospital with Covid.
I knew from that experience what an appalling disease this is. To say that I didn't care about the suffering that was being inflicted on the country is simply not right.
some will never be persuaded by Boris Johnson's arguments. He insists he was at all times focused on saving lives. Vicky Young, BBC News.
The serial killer, Steve Wright, has been arrested in connection with the unsolved murder of Vicky Hall in Suffolk in 1999. The 17-year-old went missing after a night out with a friend in Felixstowe. Her body was found in a ditch 5 days later. Wright, who is 65, is currently serving life for the murder of 5 women in Ipswich in the early 2000s. Kent police say a 49-year-old man has been arrested after a 7-year-old boy was killed in a crash involving 2 vehicles in Folkestone yesterday. William Brown was hit as he tried to collect his football, according to his father. A driver of one of the vehicles left the scene. Police are appealing for motorists in the area to come forward with dashcam footage. A coroner has concluded that an Ofsted school inspection likely contributed to the death of the head teacher, Ruth Perry. Mrs. Perry took her own life after a report from the inspectors downgraded Caversham Primary School in Reading from its highest rating to its lowest, following concerns over safeguarding. Staff at the school said the head teacher was left tearful and incoherent after the inspection in November last year. Bramwyn Jeffries reports.
Ruth Perry took her life on the 8th of January this year. Today, a coroner said an Ofsted inspection contributed. After the verdict, Ruth Perry's husband and elderly parents stood alongside her sister Julia.
The inquest into Ruth's death has shown the brutal inhumanity of the system of Ofsted inspections.
She gave their judgment on the inspection system.
Callous, perverse, inhumane.
In court, the coroner criticised the way the Ofsted inspection was carried out. She said it lacked fairness, respect and sensitivity, and at times was rude and intimidating. Ofsted had argued the inspection was professional and sensitive. It's been a long 11 months for the family. This afternoon, I heard from Julia Waters in her only interview about the verdict.
We were right. What we've been saying, what other head teachers have been saying, what the teaching unions have been saying was right. And Ofsted were wrong, and they weren't prepared to admit that.
After Ruth died, her sister Julia found some handwritten notes, including one dated from Christmas Day.
I have seen examples of suicides, forced removal, resignation in shame.
Ruth Perry knew an inadequate grade might mean the loss of her job. She had gone to Caversham Primary with Julia as a child and cared deeply about what the community thought. Tonight, Ofsted said sorry for the distress Mrs. Perry undoubtedly experienced as a result of our inspection. It said more changes would be made. Ruth Perry's family said she would be remembered as loving, funny and kind. We shall feel her terrible loss every day for the rest of our lives. Bramwyn Jeffries, BBC News, Reading.
And if you've been affected by any of the issues raised in Bramwyn's report, you can find details of organisations offering information and support at bbc.co.uk/action line. And you can see more on this story on The Death of a Head, available on BBC iPlayer. Tributes have been paid to Benjamin Zephaniah, one of Britain's leading poets, who has died at the age of 65. He'd been diagnosed with a brain tumour just 2 months ago. The writer, professor and performer also appeared in the BBC drama Peaky Blinders. His family described him as a true pioneer and innovator. David Sillito reports.
I used to think nurses were women. I used to think police were men. I used to think poets were boring until I became one of them.
And this is Benjamin Zephaniah.
My mum.
Benjamin Zephaniah.
I love my mother and my mother love me. We come so far from over the sea.
He rose to fame in the 80s. His dub poetry rooted in the rhythms, language and street politics of his home, Handsworth in Birmingham. His words were political, musical, radical. He turned down an OBE, saying they'd obviously not read his words about empire. When he began, he could barely read. By the end, he had 16 honorary doctorates. And for one friend and fellow poet, his passing, a terrible loss.
He was incredibly friendly, approachable, kind on a personal basis. He could talk to us about things that matter and the things that mattered to him, which is the oppression that he himself experienced, but he sees and saw around him in the world. And he could express that to almost any age of person in very direct terms.
He also appeared more recently in Peaky Blinders.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join together in holy matrimony.
In a statement, his family said he was a true pioneer and innovator who has left the world a joyful and fantastic legacy, the poetry of Benjamin Zephaniah.
I am not the problem. I greet you with a smile. You put me in a pigeonhole, but I am versatile. Well, these conditions may affect me as I get older, and I am positively sure I have no chips upon my shoulders. Black is not the problem. Mother country, get it right. And just for the record, some of my best friends are white.
The poet and writer Benjamin Zephaniah, who has died at the age of 65. The government has announced the BBC licence fee will increase by £10.50 to £169.50 a year from next April. The rise is about £5 less than expected. The BBC is already making £500 million worth of savings as the licence fee has been frozen for the past 2 years. The corporation said it would mean more changes to its budgets. Now, she danced with Vladimir Putin at her wedding. Now, Austria's former foreign minister, Karin Kneißl, has moved to Russia. She says she was forced out of Austria by political pressure and has found freedom in Russia, describing President Putin as the most intelligent gentleman. She's been speaking to our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, in St. Petersburg.
Dancing the waltz, Vladimir Putin and Karin Kneißl in 2018. Then Austria's foreign minister, she'd invited Russia's president to her wedding. A private visit, strictly. But just months after the Salisbury poisonings, which the EU, like the UK, had linked to the Russian state. Now, with her boxer Winston Churchill, Karin Kneißl has moved to St. Petersburg. She claims that after leaving office, she had problems at home. She was seen as too close to Russia.
It was all about not being able to work. So this was number one, and that was political pressure.
She's running a Russian think tank. Controversial, considering Russia's war in Ukraine.
Isn't there a danger that by being here you are legitimising the invasion, the war, and also the domestic repression that takes place in Russia?
Well, so far I have not seen any sort of repression in my immediate surrounding. I can work here in a kind of academic freedom, which I started missing when I was still teaching at various universities inside the
But just a few days ago, in this city, a young Russian woman was sent to prison for 7 years for replacing some price tags in a supermarket with anti-war slogans.
Yeah, and so what do I have to do with that? I just explained at length the situation that I've been going through.
And what about that dance?
You see, I have done other things in my life before and after, and honestly, it's so boring. Honestly, it's very boring.
To talk about the wedding?
Yes, yes.
So we should just...
I mean, I think there are other more interesting topics we can discuss, honestly.
You have no regrets?
I consider it as honestly boring, and the dog just fell asleep and was snoring because he knows the topic.
And her view now of Vladimir Putin?
He is the most intelligent gentleman, with the focus on gentleman, and I met a few, in the sense of what Jane Austen wrote about the accomplished gentleman in Pride and Prejudice. He amounts to these standards.
We're seeing a wave of repression domestically, and we've seen Russia invade Ukraine. It's hard to classify that as a gentlemanly action.
Well, Tony Blair, Cameron, they all were involved with their governments being involved in military actions.
Finally, I mean, you say that there are people in Austria who've accused you or accuse you of high treason. accuse you of being
a Russian spy.
A Russian spy. Can you, to an extent, understand?
No, not to an inch. Not even to an inch. I don't understand it. It's just dirty fantasy.
The former Austrian diplomat who claims to have been hounded in the West and moved east at a time when the gulf between Russia and Europe feels wider than ever. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, St. Petersburg.
Now, this is Thomas Street in Manchester city centre, normally home to independent shops and bars. But for weeks now, it has been closed off, with locals sworn to secrecy about what this was all about. Well, tonight all has become clear, because one of the biggest names in fashion, Chanel, chose the street to stage its annual luxury catwalk show called the Métier d'Art. Our culture correspondent Charlotte Gallagher was there.
High fashion and a Manchester high street. The legendary French fashion label Chanel has taken over the city centre. Models, celebrities, and the children of Manchester icons Liam and Noel Gallagher filled the front row of the Chanel fashion show. Even A-list actors couldn't keep away.
Are you enjoying the waitress?
Yeah, I am. I've been walking around in the rain all day. It was fine. No, it's so good, and I'm telling you, it's like it is such an iconic place for me, and I've been dreaming to come.
The show celebrated not just fashion, but also the music of Manchester. The rapper and actor Bugsy Malone came dressed for the occasion.
We have the jacket, the watch, the trainers. You know, I'm very serious about this Chanel thing right now.
And the necklace, is that Chanel as well?
Yeah.
You're Manchester, obviously.
Born and bred.
So what does it feel like to be at a Chanel show in Manchester? You're one of the guests of honour.
By the way, it's a real privilege just to have Chanel in Manchester, you know? So to be here, to witness it, amazing. I've had a great time.
People who didn't have a ticket also wanted to see what was going on.
Obviously, there's a nod to the weather.
In fact, the crowds gathered in the rain all day, wondering which celebrities would arrive. So why did Chanel choose Manchester?
And that's a history that is political, it's social, but also, of course, linked to fashion and textiles. So in this area where we are, in the Northern Quarter, a lot of these buildings would have been warehouses, they would have been centres of production of cotton. In the 19th century, Manchester was called Cottonopolis.
Manchester-born supermodel Karen Elson took part in the show. And models weren't just on the catwalk, they were in the audience too.
Really epitomised the spirit and creativity of Manchester and the North, and yeah, it's been amazing.
The show may be over, but the party here, well, that's just begun. Charlotte Gallagher, BBC News, Manchester.
Football now, and in the Premier League, Everton's points deduction appears to have galvanised the team's spirit at Goodison Park. Tonight they beat high-flying Newcastle 3-0 to move out of the relegation zone. In tonight's other match, West Ham won 2-1 at Tottenham. Andy Swiss watched the action.
Everton fans booing the Premier League anthem, still furious at their club's recent 10-point penalty. And against Newcastle, that frustration didn't look like easing.
Calvert-Lewin's blazing over the bar.
Dominic Calvert-Lewin with a glorious chance to put them ahead, and didn't he just know it? But after the break, stepped forward Dwight McNeil with spectacular results. A stunning strike to put the hosts ahead, and that was just the start, as Abdoulaye Doucouré coolly added a second. Suddenly, Goodison Park was rocking, and Beto duly rounded off a 3-0 win. Everton now out of the relegation zone, and for their fans, finally something to celebrate. Meanwhile, it was a colourful night at Tottenham, as Spurs took an early lead against West Ham. Christian Romero putting Tottenham in front. But come the second half, it was all change, as Jared Bowen equalised for West Ham before one of the more bizarre winners you'll see. James Ward-Prowse eventually giving the Hammers a 2-1 win.
Another gift of a goal for West Ham United.
Delight for them, but for Spurs, another difficult night. Andy Swiss, BBC News.
Weather now, Simon King's here. Hello.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, it's been a very wet day for many of us, actually. We've had heavy rain spreading its way north and eastward across many parts of the United Kingdom. But towards the southwest of England, well, it's here where we've had most of the rain. In fact, in Devon, we've had around about half of December's rainfall falling in the space of a day. That's led to some localised flooding. But as that rain cleared away, well, look at that, a beautiful sunset in Devon with those red skies. Now, the rain is still with you across the eastern areas of England. It's continuing to push away tonight. Still some fairly strong winds around the northern Isles of Scotland through tonight, and then further showers will start to spread their way in from the west. But a frost-free night, temperatures down to about 4 to 6 degrees. Now, Friday, showers will move their way in across western areas. Some of those could be on the heavy side, blustery winds around the Irish Sea coast. But towards eastern and southeastern areas of England, here it should be largely dry. There'll be some sunny spells for much of the day, and temperatures for many getting into double figures, 8 or 9 degrees in the far north. But the rain lingers in the far northeast of Scotland. Now, through the evening, more persistent rain will spread into Northern Ireland, southwestern Scotland. The winds starting to pick up here as well. And as we go into the weekend, well, it's going to remain unsettled. There'll be some rain at times, strong winds as well, but also a bit of sunshine. Now, Saturday morning starts off very wet across Wales and southern England. That rain is going to quickly move its way northward. Eventually, there'll be some sunny spells developing in central and southern areas, but that rain pushes into Northern Ireland, into central areas of Scotland. Temperatures in the north, single figures. Further south, 11 to 14 degrees. But by Sunday, well, we'll do it all again because this area of low pressure will move in. And again, we're going to see some wet weather pushing in with some strong winds, Sophie.
Simon, thank you. And that's it from us. Newsnight is getting underway on BBC Two with Victoria Derbyshire on BBC One. It's time now for the news where you are. Goodbye.